Welcome to the fifth in our series of broadcasting talks here at Middlesex University, London, where we're encouraging students to think critically, but also giving them the skills to make great television using facilities like the television studio here at the Grove. Today, we'll be talking to Sian Kevill, a former editor of Newsnight and BBC Director of Global News, who now runs her own production company. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of broadcasting talks. There is one more after Easter where two students will do a thorough assassination job on me. But until that point, we have with us Sian Kevill. He's a very old friend of mine. Sian actually went to school in the county of Middlesex before going up to Newnham College, Cambridge, and after a couple of years after graduating, she then joined the BBC and actually started as a news trainee, which in the old days, if you got the news traineeship, you were pretty much well in. And Sian, like many other people who were news trainees, had an illustrious career within the BBC. Spent most of your time at Newsnight, didn't you, on the way up, and eventually becoming the first female editor of Newsnight, which is no mean achievement. Having worked on that programme and worked in that environment, it took a lot of courage and ability to do that. Sian then went on eventually to become the director of BBC World News in 2008, and after a couple of years doing that, decided that the world beyond the BBC held all sorts of adventure, and now runs a production company of her own, and is a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. So we look forward to that paper coming out in several months' time. Now, Sian, I mean, you hear it said all the time, don't you, that journalism is tough to get into. But I always take the view that it was always tough to get into. Do you think it's any tougher than it was?
I agree with you. I think it was always tough to get into. I think if it's got tougher, I think it's got tougher in two ways. I think it's got tougher if you want to get into a big media organisation. The training programme that I did at the BBC, I think they still may do it, but it's on and off. Yeah, but it's on and off. And a lot of the other big media organisations now no longer invest as much as they did in that type of developing their own talent. And bluntly, that's partly because there are courses like you're on, and they expect, people to come in, with good journalism degrees now, and that takes off some of the, the training that they used to do. So I think it's harder in that way. There's sort of fewer entry points if you want to get into those big media organisations. And I think it's also harder in a slightly more ill-defined way, but, everything has gone global. So, ultimately, if you're going into Reuters, Thompson, you're actually not just competing as you would have at one point against, your peers in the UK. You're actually now competing against, your peers who are training on many of these programmes around the world. And that's both, exhilarating, because it's great to see, new talent, new perspectives coming into journalism. But it's also obviously makes it a bit more difficult if you're only going for that defined small group of jobs. But I think conversely, I think what's quite interesting is there are so many more ways to do journalism now which aren't controlled by, in a sense, the powers that be. I mean, there are everything from blogs through to new startups, through to doing it yourself, through to working with small groups of people, foundation funding. There's a whole set of ways in which journalism, can now be done, which would not have, just weren't there when, I sort of applied to go onto the BBC journalism training course. So, there are pros and cons. It's just as difficult. You have to be just as committed, just as passionate as you ever were, but there are just slightly different paths that you can make it in there.
So look, when you graduated from Cambridge, you could have done an awful lot of things, but you decided to be a journalist. Why?
Well, I suppose I know it's well. Maybe it won't sound stupid. It was because I suppose I got accepted on the course. I know, I know it's a really, I probably would have ended up in that area in some other form, but it was one of those moments. I hadn't done a huge amount of journalism at university. I had done some radio, Cambridge radio, when I was there. And then I did a few bits of travelling and worked on a magazine writing about Far Eastern events, and then I worked at the World Service for a little while, and then I got onto the training scheme. So it wasn't a sort of natural progression. So I was in that area and probably would have always done some kind of writing. But I suppose it was that's when the first point where I did things like, journalism and law, and shorthand and all those things that you associate with, typewriting and getting your skill. There's all those things you associated with, the hard-bitten journalist. That was the first time I sort of came across any of those. When we started, actually to get the kit, the cost of the kit, the cost of the raw materials was just so much that you had to do it through a big organisation. Whereas now, there are just, you can get cameras, you can edit. One of the things of going back into doing production again, you realise how unskilled I am compared to the young people I work with, all of whom can shoot and edit.
So leaving aside the fact that the news trainee scheme focused your mind on becoming a journalist or really getting to grips with what being a journalist was all about, do you think what appealed to you then in that journey that you take as a journalist is the same kind of thing that appeals to young people now, that should appeal to? I mean, the sense of wonder of being able to go and talk to whoever you want, ask us any type of question you want, the kind of, if you like, almost the intellectual freedom of it.
If you have an inquiring mind, it is a brilliant job. If you have that, creative impulse as well, in terms of putting together a narrative, putting together a story, finding pictures, finding sound, finding things which make it alive and make it connect to people. It's just a brilliant job. I can't say it isn't.
That news trainee scheme, I'm quite interested in that because, of course, it gave you a view of the broadcast world, which was both technical but also political, because you were being set up. All of you did that course. I mean, and it was about 12 people a year, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think that gave you a chance to do something in journalism that many people don't get the chance to do?
Well, I mean, it obviously opened doors. So, I mean, I think it also opened you up to another thing that you need to understand about journalists. It's incredibly competitive. And, although from the outside it looked as though you're one of 12 people who were sort of anointed to, go high, I could tell you on the course it just felt like, you were up against everybody else, and everybody's shoulders were sharp, and everybody was angling for that job on the Today programme or that job there, and and that's also a truth in journalism. You have to accept, nobody opens doors for you. You often have to go and kick them down or persuade people against their better judgment that they should trust you and give you something to do, and that is not. It's not easy. You've got to feel you've got confidence in yourself, which is why the course that you're on is really good. You're going to come out knowing how to do this. Knowing that you've got the skills to go in and say to somebody, "Give me a job. I can do it well for you." And you've got to be very confident about yourself.
You chose very early on not to go down the on-camera route, didn't you? To stay behind the scenes and pull the strings, as it were. Yeah,
I think there were two reasons, one of which was quite a personal reason. It's about how you assess yourself, and I don't particularly bother about my appearance hugely. I don't put loads of makeup on and things like that, and the thought of having to go into a job which required me to think a lot about my appearance just didn't appeal to me at all. And the second one is one that I'll probably only admit to now, which is that I have a terrible penchant for double entendres by accident. So, and I did, on one of my college, the equivalent when I went out to do live, when you have to go out, you have to do all your links on the ground where you were and then come back and edit it all together really quick so you can hit the deadline. And I just put together this report, and it's just started off, I won't say what it was, I started off with a double entendre, and the whole report just had everybody in fits of laughter, because you couldn't have done it better if you tried. So I thought after that, if I have this penchant, I mean, to try it, you have to do live broadcasting, you know, if you go on camera. It's very hard to do anything other than live in news at some point in your career. So I just thought, it's not really going to happen. So I went behind the scenes.
Was that a choice, do you think, that played to your strengths?
I think that maybe, you know, maybe my double entendre thing I took a little bit too far. It's actually, I quite enjoy it.
It's part of character, though, isn't it? That's partly character. I mean, you know, you tone it down eventually.
I would.
You have to.
I would have, yes, eventually I would have. So I think looking back on it, I still think I made the right decision. I'm ultimately, and I suppose it's why I ended up in places like Newsnight. I'm quite, you know, I like journalism. I also have quite an analytical side to me, and I like team. I like encouraging other people. So I suppose it did make more sense for me to go into managed teams as opposed to be one of the people who was managed. So,
from that early part of your career, what are some of the most memorable moments? I always remember a report you did, I think you're the producer on it on Newsnight on I don't know why I remember this one, but about tortoises being the sort of the opening of spring. That was a really funny film.
That was the funnest, one of the funnest things I did. Yeah, we had a slightly mad editor who I've always tried to emulate, who just decided. He said to me, "Go and find some new reporting talent." So I was sent off and was combing through reporters on papers, and I came across a number of them, including Michael Gove, who did actually, he does write very nicely, but anyway, he didn't, I didn't go here. I went for a woman who was also a bit mad called Amanda Mitchison, who currently still writes, I think, for the Daily Telegraph. And anyway, the thing she wanted to make was a film about tortoises. So this slightly mad editor said, "Oh yes, all right, go off and make a film about tortoises." So we did. We got practically, you know, all the archive of tortoises from the BBC, songs about tortoises and tortoise races in Worcester College in Oxford, and found out all sorts of things about tortoises. And it was just great fun.
Of course, coming back to the reality of trying to operate as a journalist now, we've become under intense scrutiny, haven't we? Not just in broadcast, and particularly in newspapers. And those two sacrosanct principles of public service broadcasting, impartiality and trust. How much do you think all that effort that we put in every day to get things right has been compromised by, you know, on the one hand Leveson, on the other hand Pollard?
I think there's lots of people who go to one end of that argument and just say that, you know, with blogs, the internet, deregulation, you know, it is, you know, it's you replace impartiality with transparency. You know, you sort of declare your hand, who you're writing for, what your proclivities are, and somehow that allows everybody to judge. And I just don't go along with that. I think that as journalists, it's a trade. It's a craft. I think it's absolutely true that impartiality isn't a state of grace that you're born into, or you just become impartial when you become say you're a journalist. It's actually something you've got to work really hard at. You know, you have to learn to recognise that other people can have a different viewpoint. You've got to take that on board. You've got to do the devil's advocate. You've got to challenge yourself. You've got to listen to the facts that they're throwing at you, which you really don't believe, but you know, you've got to look at them, you've got to pull them apart, you've got to understand them. It's all part of what you do as a journalist. And, you know, at the end of it, if you're not striving to tell accurate, truthful, impartial information, you may not ever get there. But the fact is that, you know, by aiming to do that, you're going to get closer. And ultimately, I think if you're a good journalist, that's why people will want to read you.
Of course, the programme you edited for a long time, Newsnight itself, come under the spotlight, hasn't it? You know, with Saville. How do you account for that? I mean, you've been on record, haven't you, for about Saville and the kind of challenge it presents to those people who've got to keep the brand, you know, strong. What was your take on that?
I think that at its most basic, there was an editor who just made the wrong decision, in my view. Having said that, I still defend him. he still should be able to make that decision of not running something. But then I feel that management, there's layers coming, the management had obviously weren't properly gauging what was going on that programme, because there was obviously sufficient evidence, you'd have thought, if there were the sort of discussions that you should have between, an editor and reporters and senior management colleagues. It's extraordinary that that evidence wasn't assessed, I suppose, properly, in my view. So I think it was for me it was a big journalistic mistake. And I think if you're going to take one lesson out of it, it's that you can be damned for being cautious as much as you can be damned for taking a risk. But, the one thing you're there for, and that's what Leveson today reminds us all, is that, you are there as part of a democracy. You're there as the Fourth Estate. You're there on behalf of people to question power. You're there to keep people on the straight and narrow. And it's only by asking those questions, being brave enough to ask the questions, hold people to account, that you keep actually democracy safe. And I know that quite profoundly. So currently I'm working on a set of debates in Egypt and Tunisia, and there you see democracy in its most raw, embryonic forms. And what you have there are some incredibly brave journalists, but on the whole a media landscape that isn't attuned. And even people who are not attuned to asking questions or feeling that you have the right to ask a question of a politician. And that's when you suddenly get into perspective of how blasé we can all be in this country about things like question time, through to pursuing Murdoch, actually saying Murdoch is no better than anybody else. He has to answer questions about what his business has been up to. Because it's amazing, once you get into power, you have this sort of sense that you don't have to answer to anybody. And that's where we as journalists have to just keep in there and keep doing it. And it's really, and I know this from now having worked, it's sort of changed my perspective, it's so important. If you're not there, democracy does not function, full stop.
There's a danger, isn't there, with the fragmentation of the market. And to be an investigator takes resources, it takes time, it means putting your neck on the line occasionally with controversial subjects that actually, although people can buy into that approach, actually the climate at the moment is militating against it.
I think very much so, and as you have probably studied, you've got the whole rise of journalism, and just rewriting press releases and things like that with a couple of, check calls. And, I don't think that's going to sort of go away. I think part of what I'm looking at the Reuters Institute is about these new sources of funding coming into journalism. And, as we move away from, you've got the Reuters Thompson, the BBC and the big beasts, and into this sort of wild west of other funding and other ways, from Kickstarter campaigns through to foundations, through to charities, through to lots of people now, can fund or would pretend to fund journalism. But it's quite clear that when you're used to something like a BBC way of funding journalism, it's quite hard to work out what does, if Save the Children, pays to do, I don't know, a seed corn trip to persuade somebody to do a bit of journalism in, I don't know, Mali or something. Does that mean the journalism is less valid than another bit of journalism? And, if it doesn't take place as a journalist, do you feel that's a loss to, people's you know, ability to be informed and to know about things. So do you go and do that? And I think these are a whole load of ethical questions that you, as journalists, have to face.
That's a partiality question, is it not?
Well, it is. Yeah, it's an impartiality question. You know, is the fact that they say, you know, we'll fund something because we believe there's a very good story here, but we will fund you, and you as journalists go with complete editorial freedom, we'll sign all the bits, you know, to go and find out, and then if it is, you can use the material as a taster tape to pay to a broadcaster who then might commission it. Do you do it? Do you not do it? I mean, these are all interesting ways. You know, where do you cross the bounds? How do you maintain your impartiality? Are there any, you know, how do you say, I will look at children because you'll save the children, but I won't feature any of you? Or, you know, how do you draw those lines? And I think it's a really interesting area. As I say, you go into this wild west of funding, and you know, got corporations funding things, all sorts of people funding things, and you know, how both as a practitioner and indeed how do the audience understand this stuff, because it's all out there, it's going to be on the internet, some of it will be picked up and broadcast.
Now, of course, we're living through this whole media transformation, the new digital transformation, and you quite rightly say that opens up lots of opportunities. Do you think there are dangers, though, that technological shift and the compression of time that we've just talked about actually changes the craft, actually changes particularly the core craft of storytelling, or narrative, as you put it at the very beginning? I mean, in the end, we don't want to be making boring TV because nobody will want to watch it. They'll go and do something else, won't they? How do we retain that sense of craft and storytelling with all these compressed timelines, fewer resources?
God, well, I mean, it's a toughie. I mean, bluntly, you know, I think that there is. I think it's also recognition. There are different skills. I mean, we've actually, I think, in our career, we've seen a whole new set of skills developing around 24-hour news, which is a very different beast to you know, a daily single half-hour news programme or an hour news programme, to, you know, a documentary which may take a week or 2 weeks, and obviously you've got the internet which can be updated every moment. So it you know, there are different skills, and I suppose in a way you've got to work out what gives you the biggest buzz. You know, now doing a breaking story, when we did breaking stories, I mean, you know, you'd sometimes still have a couple of hours to get them on air, you know, before the next bulletin came on, whereas now you've got to deal with it immediately, with all the, and obviously there's been a huge amount of thinking around, you know, are you first or are you right, and then are you second? You know, certainly the BBC did a huge amount of thinking around that, and that's where some of the thinking around transparency, I think, does work, which is that you're very transparent about what you know, where you know it from, how do you know it, at every stage as a story sort of develops. But it's a whole new skill of creating news. How do you fill the time intelligently without, you know, without creating rumours and noise and things which which can you know, create a cacophony rather than any clarity. So I think there's a whole skill in 24-hour news which is developing, and you know, which is, I think, quite exciting. And you know, creating the narrative in that is interesting. How you create the narrative, how you suddenly, you know, you've got to work back through a story, get different people on to explain the backstory of it as the event unrolls and develops. And how you put the analysis in alongside keeping up with events as they analyse, all the you know, the stuff coming in from citizen journalists now on iPhones, and how you check all of that before you put it out. It's a fantastically interesting area, and then, you know, I think you have to. So I suppose that little anecdote is that I think you come around to learning how to tell stories in a different way, and you know, while conventionally a story is this either a 3-minute package which is beautifully crafted or a half-hour film, you know, now there are many different ways to create a narrative, and you know, I think that's a wonderful you know, not challenge is always the word, isn't it, that you've all got, is, you know, how do you create narratives with all these different ways that you can present material on air?
Do you think it makes it the big beasts of the BBC and ITN and Sky, do you think it makes them less relevant in this fragmented world?
No, I don't. I think ultimately you may have a video like the one with Joseph Kony, which went viral, millions of people viewed it, but immediately, where did it come from? Do you believe it? And it's only when I think the big beasts sort of pick it up and then do the analysis, do a lot of people then sort of think, okay, now I can contextualise, now I know where it comes from, now I understand why they were doing it, and that I therefore, I believe this much of it, but maybe I don't believe that bit of it. So I still think there's a really important role for the big beasts, but I think it's, there's a lot more ways. It's a bit like there are dinosaurs, but there's a lot of undergrowth for mammals, so it's quite fun.
Of course, you've moved on from the BBC and you're now in the independent sector. It's almost like,
I am one of those mammals.
You're a gamekeeper turned poacher, going the other way now, So, I mean, as a poacher now, do you see it slightly differently in the sense that, of course, you're having to pitch now? Of course, you've got a lot of experience behind you, so you know better how to pitch. But nevertheless, it's still a tough ask to get people to buy your ideas, isn't it?
Incredibly hard, yeah. I now realise how wonderful it is to be a commissioner, where you could just choose, whatever you thought was interesting, and now you have to try and persuade somebody else. Actually, what you realise, you just, if you've got a good enough germ of idea, I've decided the art of pitching is not to pitch, but to sort of listen to what they want. And then sort of somehow make your idea sound as though it's exactly what they want, yes. So it is really very, very different. I actually think, I was talking earlier to somebody outside that we've actually set the company up, in London, but also in Singapore. And actually, I think, just to try and to actually just try and commission in the area that we're in particular, like I'm in factual journalism, I would actually say you can't make a business out of it. It's just too one-off, too hit and miss, incredibly difficult to make work, and in a very crowded market. So having Singapore sort of gives you another market to work in. And obviously I'm working in the Middle East as well. So, ultimately I think, it's one of those awful things where I think you have to go sort of global again, if you're in that world now, because actually trying to, the sort of the days when a small indie could set up in the UK and make it, I think bluntly have not gone, because there's always the exception that proves the rule, but it's very, very hard.
I mean, in the end, the BBC, ITV, Sky, Al Jazeera, they want content. So where is it going wrong that it makes it more difficult to produce that content for them? Is it just the sums don't add up?
Well, I think there's two things which are going on which make it very difficult at the moment. Firstly, if you're a start-up, firstly, they want to reduce risk. And I do understand this as a commissioner. You're putting a lot of money on the table to make something, so you want to reduce risk. But the nature of reducing risk means that they basically expect the indie to take all of the risk themselves of development, pretty much. They want to have taster tapes, which means you have to have filmed something, you have to have half researched, more than half researched the story. So if you imagine the length of time it takes to get all of that together to do a persuasive pitch, they have offloaded a whole load of risk around development onto unpaid people, firstly. And then on top of that, budgets come down. Budgets have come down. So whereas you could have done that and recouped your development cost out of a budget which was worth fighting for, now all you're getting is the money to make something. So you don't have any money afterwards to do more development because the money isn't there in the budgets. So and that's not all of them. There are still some good budgets on some of the main strands, but obviously they're incredibly competitive, and a lot of those are locked down by the bigger indies who have been in the market longer or got more resources and, can basically pitch for big contracts.
So no more film on tortoises.
No more films about tortoises, I can tell you that much. No. So anyway, it's tough, and I don't think it's worth beating about the bush. It is a really tough, to get into. I think, go and work with a big indie. I would say, don't try and set yourself up on your own. When you start off, unless you are an auteur filmmaker, I would say to get the sort of level of experience you want, try and get into one of the big broadcasting companies or one of the big indies, because it's only by getting that throughput of experience that you can then potentially go on and I think sort of launch something yourself. But I wouldn't necessarily do it myself.
Well, I noticed that in your company you've taken on an internee.
I don't know.
Yeah. What does that mean? Somebody for
An
6 months, an intern, 6 months, a year. Is that a route into the business? If you're advising starters, students who've just second, third year, is that a route in?
I mean, I would do it. I'm really ambivalent about this, to be honest. It may be something you could do an internship for, just cost. I just think it's outrageous if anybody asks you to do it for nothing or subsidise yourself. At least get your travel costs and some food costs for the day. I don't think you should be out of pocket for doing an internship. So I would get that. If you do it, I think doing it during your degree, I think is brilliant. The more of it you can do, the better, because a lot of the industry does come down to relationships. It's about getting in there, people liking you, and you're doing a good job, and then they'll go with it. And I think. The intern I've got is actually just a friend of my son's. So I agreed to do it on that basis. But I said to him, I say to him like a mother sort of every day, well, apply for something else because, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you work long term. So I'm doing it while you haven't got anything else to do. But certainly this isn't a way into the industry. So I think you've got to be very, very careful of internships because there's a lot of people out there. If you just listen to what I said about the economics of independent production, you can see why people will take you on because they've got to do stuff for nothing. So they will take you on to do that stuff for nothing. Bluntly.
A cautionary tale. Some questions from people who are here. Philip, you've got a question.
You said earlier that it's not very common for big news companies to have their own trainee programs anymore, and I was wondering where do they get the good people from nowadays? Do they just apply from universities? Do the big companies trust the university that the uni has done a good job in educating the new journalists, new aspiring journalists? So where do they come from, the good new people?
Well, I think there's always different routes in, but I would say that on the whole now, most organisations will take from, a university course, but part of it will be around, your tutor or something like that. Sometimes knowing somebody, being able to write a letter of recommendation, just in a way, some of that personal contact, is quite useful. But I think that, as I said, the money's going down, so they want people to come pretty much trained and able to go into a newsroom situation, and that's where if I had a son or daughter who wanted to become a journalist, I would very much say you will need to go onto a journalism course now. Having said that, there's never ever let the crowd always dictate. If you really believe you've got a way of doing something, or that you're confident about your writing style and you're writing your own blog, we know that the internet now can be a way of showing off your own or your wares. You see it with pop people who are sort of plucked off. Well, it's not very different, even in this world. If you've done something good on your own on the internet, or you've got a film up there which is really good and people can see it, that is going to be, and again, you can do that on a course like this. You've got the equipment to do it. You know, you can do it. So use every opportunity you've got to try things out, do something different, do something polished, do something innovative, you know, do something completely different. But try and work up a body of work which people can look at, because bluntly, I think that's part of where the industry is going. They're going to be looking at that. So it's like having a portfolio, really, of stuff that you've written, or you know, you need increasingly to be able to show what you do. And you know, there's always stars out there, and you may be one of them, who, on looking at their work, somebody just goes, "My God, you know, this person, you know, is brilliant." And whether they've been on a journalism course or not, but you know, probably more likely if you have, you know, and they will say, "Great, you know, I'm going to give them a go."
Is there one particular story that you're most proud of, whether you produced it or commissioned it?
Oh yes, and strangely it sort of links back to Savile, because I mean, the one that I was probably most proud of was one on exposing a paedophile ring in Liverpool, which was an incredibly long piece of investigation. It took about 9 months or more, I think, at secret filming, everything, and we eventually we got people sentenced to about 120 years between all of the paedophile ring, and we broke BBC guidelines by identifying them. So we had to go through a huge rigmarole about changing guidelines, because they wouldn't allow you to identify paedophiles because of the risk, because it was around the time when they'd identified, you know, one of the News of the World had identified paedophiles and they'd been attacked, so it was very sensitive at the time. But, you know, in the end, we got these guys on camera sort of completely admitting to their crimes, so there wasn't really a reason to, you know, cover their faces. You know, we just had to phone them before it went out and tell them that that somebody will be knocking at their door shortly and they probably ought to go with the police. So it was that was an incredible investigation, and I think for me, which is why, having been through that, I found that the subsequent investigation with Savile was so odd, was that, you know, you talk through everything. You know, I mean, it was a constant case of talking through with your reporter, you know, with your immediate line boss, you know, exactly what you got. And the final film, you know, you were talking to, you know, effectively the head of news, and you were going through everything with them. So I just find it incredible, whatever happened with the Savile, that those sort of conversations weren't taking place on a very important bit of journalism. You don't have to do it on everything, but there are certain stories which you know are going to be pretty explosive, and that you ought to talk to a few people about them. So I found that really, really odd. But that was probably one that I feel very proud of. And we did it, nobody knew about it. We did it, a whole programme. It was 45 minutes long, and we got one of the biggest audiences ever with no publicity whatsoever. We had about 2.5 million watching at about 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. It was amazing.
Anybody else? Yes, Anne.
Yes, I have several questions, but you said that budgets have come down and that the market is becoming increasingly fragmented, and so therefore, if I understand correctly, a lot of people are happy to actually get younger or not so young will-be journalists to do the work for free. So 2 questions. How is that different from before? And why are the budgets coming down so much? How, and what are the economics of it?
It is different from before, because I think, you know, if you look at the big indies now, who if you're going to work in the independent sector, go for one of the big indies. The big indies that are out there are all developed when budgets were healthy enough that you could start to invest in people, develop a company and grow. That isn't there now. And I think, you know, budgets are coming down. I mean, as I said, not there's still budgets out there where you can do some good stuff, but you know, they're quite hard to get, but they are still there. But they're coming down because everything's coming down. I mean, you know, if you think about, you know, Newsnight, you know, when I was there, it must have had a budget of about, I think probably about 11, 12 million. Whereas now, I think it's about 7 or something like that. You know, I mean, it's almost halved.
Hence a lot more studio.
Yeah, hence a lot more studio outputs. Hence, you know, no use of studio other than outputting. Fewer films, more talking heads. So, you know, it doesn't mean to say it's worse. It's different. But, you know, you can't disguise the fact that money is a function of that. And just as that has changed, if you look at current affairs, whereas there used to be several current affairs strands at one point, when John Burt took over, he invented about 2 current affairs strands. I mean, can you imagine that happening nowadays? You know, there was a huge number of outlets, and that was even you know, equivalent in even on you know, ITV and Channel 4. There were just more outlets, and now, you know, for foreign affairs, there's only This World, which has got reduced from a run of about 36, I think, now to a run of 12, 18. Those have decent budgets, but, you know, if you think about having budgets for, you know, 36 programmes, and now you're down to half that number, the budgets are still good, but I mean, my God, I mean, it's like gold dust trying to get hold of them. And that's the same right across the board. You know, true stories, you know, every outlet for current affairs has basically got shorter in length, fewer of them, and the budgets, even though they're sort of decent by comparison to something like Al Jazeera, which still does year-round stuff, they're very, very hard to get.
Do you worry about the investment in people? I mean, in the end, the industry is all about people, isn't it? You know, whether we're telling people stories or, you know, the people who are telling stories. Do you worry that there's a lack of investment in people? I mean,
Yes, I do.
People are much
actually
more expendable, as it were, in that process, rather than nurturing the talent, as Philip is quite rightly saying. You know, how do you know who the best people are if you don't take them on and invest in them?
Yeah.
Well,
I no, I'm genuinely, you know, quite worried about that. You know, again, if you go back on a programme like Newsnight, you know, there was a really big staff. I had about 60 people working for me in various capacities. And, you know, they were absolutely on Newsnight. You were taking people in. I took people in at researcher level, and you saw them work up through AP to producer to output editor. You know, some of them went off and did other things during that process. But there was a real investment and nurturing of people all the way up. And, you know, when you have the sort of the cuts and the pressure, you know, you just don't get that same sort of sense of investment and moving people up through the ranks. And you don't get the same level of working with people with a little bit of extra time to help somebody who isn't as experienced as them. And I mean, I saw this starting in my time on Newsnight when we had a thing called The Desk, where that was the thing where, you know, you were blooded on Newsnight. You know, you had to go and do the daily show, you know, where you went in the morning, you had to produce something by the end of the day. And anybody who sort of went through that for any length of time really after that felt they could do anything. You know, there used to be something like 6 people on the desk. So you could afford to sometimes start a story and not run it. And you could afford to put people together in pairs so that a junior person could work with a more senior person and start to learn. Because, as I said, journalism is ultimately a craft, it's a trade. You know, as I say, it's not a state of grace. You have to learn from people, you learn how to do things better, and you learn by emulating and working with great people. When you look now on Newsnight, they may have sometimes 3, 4 people, you know, less on the desk, and there's no way. People are then just thrown in and, you know, just have to swim. And it was always a bit like that, but it just, to me, that whole ability of being able to work with somebody who's done it and where you can learn from them is something which is going out of the industry, and I think that is a massive, massive shame. I don't know whether it matters, because none of us know yet. But, you know, it does seem to be a real problem.
Well, it sounds like it's a job of work for us here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know, we can take that on.
Yeah.
Look, I want to thank you, Sian, for coming along and giving us your pearls of wisdom. Another great session. Thanks very much.
Thank you.